Vienna, 2007. A crow is hiding food, standard procedure. It found a piece of meat, flew to a corner of the enclosure, and is covering the food with leaves and twigs. Nothing extraordinary. Except there is another crow watching. The first crow stops, looks at the observer, looks at the hiding spot, and then does something researcher Thomas Bugniar had not anticipated in the protocol. It pretends to finish hiding, and then hides for real somewhere else. Bugniar watched the recording 3 times before writing anything in his notebook. Not because the behavior was confusing, because it was too clear. Crow had lied, with intention, to a specific audience, about specific information. And to do that, to create a false belief in another being, it first needed to understand that this other being had beliefs, that those beliefs could be wrong, and that it could be responsible for that error that has a name in cognitive science, theory of mind. And until that moment, it was considered an exclusively human capacity. In the next few minutes, I'm not going to tell you about animal trickery. I'm going to show you why a crow that lies needs, before lying, to understand what you believe, and what that implies about what exists inside that skull. Bugniar's experiment was designed with surgical precision. A dominant crow named Hugin and a subordinate, Munin. Hugin hid food. Munin watched. When Hugin left, Munin raided the hiding spot. Bugniar repeated the protocol dozens of times. Then he introduced a variation. He let Hugin see Munin watching. Hugin began creating false hiding spots. It would position food in locations visible to Munin, execute all the motions of hiding, covering, pressing, adjusting, without leaving anything there. The real food went somewhere else, outside the observer's field of vision. Hugin was not responding to a stimulus. It was executing a strategy that required knowing that Munin had intentions, anticipating that those intentions included theft, and creating a false belief in Munin about the location of the food. Bugniar published the results in 2004. The scientific community responded with skepticism. The alternative hypothesis was simple. Hugin had learned through conditioning that hiding in visible locations resulted in loss. No theory of mind required. Then Bugniar added a second variable. He replaced Munin with a crow Hugin had never encountered. A stranger. No history of theft. Hugin kept using false hiding spots. It wasn't responding to a past experience with that individual. It was responding to the presence of an observer, any observer. Because what mattered wasn't who was there. It was the fact that someone was watching. Conditioning explains animals that learn rules. It doesn't explain animals that model the mental state of strangers to anticipate behaviors that haven't happened yet. That's something else. And what comes next is harder to contain inside a comfortable explanation. Nicola Clayton at the University of Cambridge dedicated years to one specific question. Do corvids know when they've been watched? Not whether they were watched, when. The experiment worked like this. California scrub jays hid food in the presence of an observer. They were then left alone and allowed to move the food if they chose. Clayton measured whether the probability of moving the hiding spot depended on who had observed the original act. Jays that had a history of stealing food from others, that knew from personal experience that hiding spots could be raided, consistently moved their food when they had been observed. Jays without a theft history didn't do this. Not because they were less intelligent, because they didn't have the necessary information. To know that an observer might steal, you have to have been a thief. What Clayton discovered isn't that corvids are clever, it's that they project their own experience onto the behavior of others. They use what they know about themselves to model what others would do. In philosophy of mind, this is called simulation. It's one of the proposed mechanisms to explain how humans develop empathy. The ability to imagine another being's internal state using your own internal state as reference. A corvid that stole food and then uses that memory to anticipate an observer's behavior is doing what we call putting yourself in someone else's shoes. There's something unsettling about realizing that a bird can model what you believe. If you've ever felt that a crow was reading your intention, not just your position, your intention, leave it in the comments. This investigation needs more data points. This channel exists for the cases that science has documented and still doesn't know how to fully name. If that makes sense to you, the subscribe button is here. The next video goes deeper into what was left unanswered today. What makes all of this harder is this. These behaviors weren't documented in a natural environment. They were documented in a laboratory. Control and variance, isolated variables, replicable results. What happens when this capacity operates in an urban environment with decades of accumulated observation, with cultural transmission across generations, with entire flocks sharing information about specific human faces and behaviors, has not yet been measured with sufficient precision. The laboratory showed the mechanism. The city is where it scales. There is a technical problem that corvid cognition researchers face and rarely discuss publicly. The scientific language available to describe what they observe was built for less complex systems. Terms like adaptive behavior, conditioned response, and associative learning began as precise descriptors. Over time, they became euphemisms, ways of naming something without saying what it is. Bugniar described in an interview the moment Hugin executed the first complete deception sequence. He said the difficulty wasn't understanding what had happened. It was deciding how to write it down. Because the words available on the form, attempt, error, reinforcement, response, didn't describe what he had seen. And using the correct words implied a conclusion the scientific community was not prepared to formally accept. The conclusion was that Crow had communicated to someone what it believed another mind was planning to do. In 2016, a systematic review of 17 studies on theory of mind in corvids concluded that the evidence was sufficient to affirm that corvids possess, at minimum, a primitive form of attribution of mental states to other individuals. At minimum primitive is the language science uses when the data points to something larger than it is prepared to name. There is a question this body of evidence installs about what it means that another species models the interior of other minds, lies with intention, and transmits this capacity culturally to generations that never saw the researcher who documented it. It's not a question about crows. It's a question about what consciousness requires to exist. And if a mind completely different from ours arrived at that same territory by a path with no overlap with ours, lying is a second-order act. First, you need to have a belief. Then you need to realize that others also have beliefs. Then you need to understand that their beliefs can differ from yours. And only then can you deliberately create a false belief in another being. Each step in that chain presupposes the previous one. There is no shortcut. There is no conditioning that produces this result. Either the entire mechanism exists, or none of it works. What Bugniar and Clayton's experiments documented was not a trick. It was evidence that another species traverses this entire chain consistently, with strategic variation depending on context, with cultural transmission of the behavior among individuals who never participated in the original experiment. The capacity to lie with intention is not an isolated data point about corvids, it is an index. It points to what needs to exist underneath for the lie to be possible. And what needs to exist underneath is a theory of other minds, the same theory that allows us to feel empathy, anticipate betrayal, build trust, negotiate, teach, lie. If a brain architecture completely different from ours, without a neocortex, built along an evolutionary path with no overlap with ours, arrived at the same result, then that capacity doesn't belong to us. It's not a human achievement. It's a solution to a problem the world presents to anything complex enough to live with others. The next time a crow watches you for too long, consider the possibility that it isn't just registering your position. It may be modeling what you're going to do next. The next time you walk past a crow and it doesn't look away, if you live near crows, pay attention over the next few days. Watch if any of them follows you longer than would make sense. If it shifts position when you shift, if it stops when you stop. Whatever you observe, leave it here. Next video, a capacity that goes beyond modeling the present. Crows that plan for a future that doesn't exist yet, and give up a reward now to secure something better tomorrow. Science has a name for that, and until recently, that name belonged only to us.